We begin my top 28 remaining quarterback rankings with quarterbacks that I think are probably bottom of the barrel fantasy options for us this week. Remember that players on bye or if they play on Thursday night are not included in these rankings. So if you see somebody missing and they play it on Thursday night or if they're on bye, that's why. So we have Jacoby Brissett, Will Levis, Gardner Minshew, and Bryce Young. Jacoby Brissett just really this year doesn't present us with any upside. I mean, the situation isn't great. The offensive line is terrible. They lack any elite playmakers. Hunter Henry is fine. Pop Douglas is fine, but against Tennessee, that is about as rough as it gets. Will Levis is playing against New England. I have him projected to play if he does miss this game and Mason Rudolph plays instead. I'd probably have him ranked about 25. But Will Levis has been horrible this year. New England's defense plays well sometimes. Sometimes they're not that great. Recently, they've been playing relatively well. And so, for that reason, especially considering how poorly he's played, I really would try to avoid him and I wouldn't start him unless you really have to. Gardner Minshew against Cincinnati, while it is a plus matchup, Gardner Minshew has just not been great for us in fantasy. And so, for that reason, I do think he's an avoid. Then we have Bryce Young against New Orleans. He has more upside, in my opinion, than any of the people below him. It is so hard for me to trust Bryce Young, even with Dave Canales there. With them trading away Deontay Johnson as well, I think that just makes life even more difficult for him. And so for that reason, I'm definitely avoiding Bryce Young. I wish him the best, but I just don't see him having a high upside game in this one. Now we have low-end QB2s. We have Justin Herbert, Jameis Winston, and T-Law. Justin Herbert this past week had a very good game. He had over 40 rushing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. He generally doesn't do that. And so for that reason, despite it being a plus matchup against Cleveland, I definitely want to see that again because the passing volume has also increased recently. So that is something to keep tabs on, but I still would not trust him until we see consistency from him in terms of upside. Then we have Jameis against the Chargers. While I like the assets in the passing game, David Njoku, Tillman, as far as Jameis is concerned, this is a terrible matchup. I would be shocked if he doesn't have a multi-turnover game. And so while I think he'll get his playmakers involved, I cannot imagine him having less than 2 turnovers. Then we have T-Law against Philly. With Christian Kirk out, I think that makes life more difficult for him, obviously. I do expect Brian Thomas Jr. to play in this game. I think that'll be one of the saving graces for him. I think he's going to get Evan Ingram involved too. But against Philly and their pass rush, they made Daniel Jones's life terrible recently. And so I do think he's an avoid. But if you have to play him, you have to play him. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to low end QB2s. We have Derek Carr, Tua, Daniel Jones, Kyler Murray, Geno Smith, and Pat Mahomes. Derek Carr is playing against Carolina. I do think he returns to action in this one, obviously. While it is a plus matchup, after an incredibly hot start to the season, we saw some decline from the Saints offense. And so for that reason, I am going to be a little bit wary of Derek Carr this week, but it's a plus matchup, and he did destroy them the last time they played. Then we have Tua against Buffalo. I do think he's going to get back into the rhythm of things, but Buffalo definitely isn't an easy matchup. And so I don't think he's going to have one of these massive games this week, but you could definitely do worse at quarterback. Then we have Daniel Jones against Washington. It's middle of the road matchup. He does have rushing upside. He hasn't really displayed it recently, but I think against Washington, they're going to have to pass the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. And so I think he sees a lot of passing volume. Kyler Murray is playing against Chicago this week. I do think he has a decent amount of production in this game. I think Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride both have pretty good games. I think, though, that he's going to have a couple turnovers in this one. Chicago's defense is absolutely nasty. And so for that reason, he's a little bit lower in my rankings than he's generally going to be ranked. Geno Smith is playing against the Rams this week. I do think he gets DK Metcalf back, and so I do think that boons his fantasy value. I just don't think this week that he's going to be a top-tier option. Patrick Mahomes is playing against Tampa Bay. I do think he has a pretty good game in this one by his fantasy standards this year, at least. And so I do think I like him a lot more than I'm generally going to like him on a week-to-week basis. And so I do think has a ton of upside in this one. It's just we haven't seen it yet from him this year. But if we are ever going to see it, it's going to be this week. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably low-end QB1s to potentially high-end QB2s. We have Joe Flacco, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, Bo Nix, and Jordan Love. Joe Flacco is playing against Minnesota. Pocket passing quarterback Matt Stafford just tore them apart. I think Joe Flacco has a pretty good game as well. I don't think he throws 4 touchdowns, but still, I think he has a pretty good day in what should be a relatively high-scoring game between the two teams. Then we have Caleb Williams against Arizona. I was definitely a little bit too high on him this past week. I don't think Arizona is going to present the same challenges for him, though. And so while I don't think he has one of those massive, crazy ceiling games, I do think he's going to be a lot better in this one against Arizona. Then we have Jared Goff against Green Bay. He really hasn't been needed. He's been incredible. In my opinion, I think he should be a top 2 option for an MVP candidate this year. I think he's thrown, less than 15 incompletions in the last month or something like that. It's crazy. And so I do think he's going to be pretty good against Green Bay. I think the running backs are going to be scoring some of the touchdowns this week, though. And so I don't think he has one of these top 5 weeks, but I think he's going to be a very high upside play nonetheless, in case I'm wrong. Bo Nix is playing against Baltimore. I think he has a ton of upside in this one. He's been a huge surprise to me, at least. And in what is a very good matchup for him, I think he is going to have a lot of volume in what should be a pretty high-scoring game between the two teams. Then we have Jordan Love against Detroit. He had a very poor week against Jacksonville before he got hurt. I do think he plays in this one, and I do think against Detroit, he's going to have a much better week. And so I do think it returns to being a QB1 for us. I just don't think he's going to be a high-end QB1 this week. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are firmly QB1s, mid to low-end ones. We have Sam Darnold, Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, Kirk Cousins, and Matt Stafford. Sam Darnold is playing against Indianapolis. I think this is going to be a very good game for him. He hasn't been playing as well in real life as he's been playing for us in fantasy. I do think, though, that against Indianapolis, this is a definite get-right game for him. Then we have Dak Prescott against the Atlanta Falcons. While CeeDee Lamb went berserk, he basically was the entirety of the passing offense for them, and so Dak didn't have a particularly great game. Atlanta's defense presents him with an opportunity to get back. I think Ferguson and Lamb have another good week this week. I do think with the expectation that Rico Dowdle returns, that's going to give him a boon in the passing game in terms of running back production as well. And so I do like him a lot more this week. Then we have Joe Burrow against the Vegas Raiders. I think T. Higgins returns, and I think that's going to be a key cog in his return to being a top 10 option. He's definitely been slacking from a fantasy perspective, but the Vegas Raiders defense is terrible, and so I think that's going to get him right back in the top 10. Then we have Baker Mayfield against Kansas City. We saw that even without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, he was awesome for us in fantasy. I think that continues even in what is a tough matchup against Kansas City. I think that the running backs are going to go off in this game, and I still think that Cade Otton is going to be a top-tier tight end for us in fantasy this week. Then we have Kirko Chains against Dallas. Yeah, against Tampa Bay this past week, he was awesome, and I think that continues against Dallas. Their defense can't stop anybody, and I think he has another incredibly efficient day and a multi-touchdown game. Then we're going to have Matt Stafford against Seattle. After tearing up Minnesota's defense, I think he continues to tear up defenses, especially in plus matchups. He finally has Puka and Cooper Kupp back. He still has Kyron Williams in the backfield. And so I do think that he is going to return to being a very solid quarterback for us in fantasy after basically being unstartable without all of his options in the passing game. And so that's awesome for him, and I expect quite a good game from him in this one. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably elite QB1s. We have Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts. Lamar Jackson is playing against Denver. We've seen a couple of 16 to 18-point games this year in what were tough matchups. I think, though, that he doesn't have quite that low of a floor this week. I think he's going to get the tight ends involved quite heavily in this one. I do think he's going to try to avoid Pat Surtain. And I think that due to the rushing upside and the threat of Derrick Henry in the running game, that Denver isn't really going to be able to stop the Ravens offense. But I think that as far as his passing production, he is going to be relatively contained compared to what we've seen against, say, Tampa Bay. Then we have Josh Allen against Miami. He's had a couple of low output weeks, but for the most part, even in tough matchups, he's been a really good start. Against Miami, Kyler Murray just had an awesome game against them. They're, in general, a tough matchup, but with Josh Allen getting Amari Cooper, I think that he's going to have yet another target to throw to in this one, and I don't think Miami's really going to be able to stop this Bills offense. Then we have Jaden Daniels against the Giants. While he was helped out by that lucky Hail Mary attempt, still props to him for getting the ball there, though. And I don't mean that to detract from how talented he is. He's incredible. That did help out his production. However, this matchup is nowhere remotely close to as tough as Chicago. And so for that reason, I think he's going to tear apart the Giants. And I think he's going to return to being a mainstay in the top 5. Then we have Jalen Hurts against Jacksonville. They actually played relatively well against Jordan Love initially. Malik Willis got the better of them. And so I think that Jalen Hurts is going to be far too much, especially considering they have A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Saquon. I think that's going to be way too much for this Jacksonville Jaguars defense. And so I think he has a ton of upside, and he is my projected QB1 this week. And so to conclude, quarterbacks that I think are probably high-end QB3s are Jacoby Brissett, Will Levis, Gardner Minshew, and Bryce Young. Quarterbacks that I think are probably low-end QB2s this week, we have Justin Herbert, Jameis Winston, and T-Law. Quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to low-end QB2s are Derek Carr, Tua, Daniel Jones, Kyler Murray, Geno Smith, and Pat Mahomes. Quarterbacks that I think are probably low-end QB1s to high-end QB2s, we have Joe Flacco, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, Bo Nix, and Jordan Love. And then quarterbacks that I think are safe QB1s, but probably not candidates to be the QB1 overall, we have Sam Darnold, Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, Kirk Cousins, and Matt Stafford. And then quarterbacks that I think are elite QB1s that are definite candidates to be the QB1 overall this week, we have Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts. All right, so you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Remember that Thursday night players are not included in this game, and obviously neither are players on bye. With that being said, make sure you check out my running back, wide receiver, and tight end rankings as they come out. I hope you crush your matchups. Please remember to like and subscribe. Thanks.